The night over the Atlantic was deep and thick, as if the darkness itself had disappeared into thin air, leaving no foothold. Where the sea and sky merged into one endless inky mass, the Swissair 3 engine liner, the powerful, confident MD-11, was on its way, illuminated only by the soft glow of the instruments in the cabin. There was no danger that night. The plane followed a familiar route, as if on rails crossing a vast, quiet void. And inside in the cockpit, there was working silence, in which only the breathing of the crew, the rustle of pages, and the slight hum of systems could be heard. Behind the pilots, in the cabin, 215 passengers were arranging an overnight flight to Geneva. Someone was already closing their eyes, hoping to sleep. Someone was leafing through a newspaper. Someone was talking quietly to a neighbor, unaware that in just an hour, their names would be in the headlines all over the world. But so far, everything was calm. The time before midnight, the usual rhythm of a nighttime transatlantic flight. No worries, just a measured, habitual movement forward. Swissair 111 has always been considered a special flight. It became almost a ritual for dozens of UN staff who flew from year to year between the two most important offices of the organization, New York and Geneva. This line was even called the UN Shuttle, a reliable, stable, almost guaranteed road between the two centers of diplomacy. There were people from 21 countries on board, most of them from the USA, Switzerland, and France. The diversity of cultures and languages made the salon lively, but still calm. Night is a time of silence, even at an altitude of 10 kilometers above the ocean. Among the luggage is a jewel, a painting by Pablo Picasso, transported to Switzerland, a symbol of status, value, and the very certainty that this flight is one of the most reliable. Nothing could have seemed safer. And certainly no one doubted those who were sitting in the cockpit. The ship's commander, Urs Zimmermann, was a man in whose biography every word was synonymous with experience. Former military pilot of the Swiss Air Force, more than 10,000 flight hours, almost 1,000 on MD-11. He was famous for his precision, attention to detail, and rare accuracy. At Swissair, he was respected not only as a pilot, but also as a man who always sought to understand the aircraft more deeply than the instructions required. He didn't just fly, he studied the car, asked engineers, understood complex systems, as if anticipating that one day this knowledge could become crucial. On the right is the co-pilot, Stefan Lev, younger, but no less experienced. Also a former military man, also an instructor, with thousands of flight hours. Calm, restrained, neat. Pilots who knew him personally said that he was a man who never raised his voice, but always remained extremely collected. He was not just a co-pilot. He was a partner in the cockpit, someone whom the commander could completely trust. Together they created a pair for which passengers could give any prize in the world if they knew who was sitting in front. The aircraft, the MD-11, was relatively young. Released just 8 years ago, it represented a new step in the aircraft industry. A powerful digital cockpit, modern electronics, triple-engine design, and high efficiency. Swissair was proud of this fleet, and even more, a new level of comfort. An entertainment system was installed on board, which was a real innovation in 1998. Movies, interactive content, and even internet access right in the passenger seat. The installation was complex in energy, intensive, but it was considered safe, because if something threatened, hundreds of airlines around the world would not use it. But no one suspected that there was a weak link in this particular innovation. The plane takes off from New York at 2018. The co-pilot confidently takes the heavy car into the sky, bypassing massive cumulus clouds with thunderstorm tops. They climb higher, change course, and look for a quiet corridor. By 21, the MD-11 is already calmly moving at an altitude of 33,000 feet. The dispatchers hear the usual. Swissair 111, level 330. We are completing the route. Nearby in the cabin, most of the lights go out. Someone's laptop is closing. Someone adjusts the blanket. Night over the ocean is a time of silence, sleep, and calm expectation of arrival. But as often happens in aviation, everything changes from something small. Stefan was the first to smell it. Barely perceptible, it doesn't look like plastic or burnt air, but rather a strange note in the familiar atmosphere of the cabin. He turned quietly to the captain. "Do you feel that?" It was a light, almost imperceptible shade, but it was there all the same. Not disturbing, just weird. A few minutes later, both saw thin streaks of smoke, almost transparent, that appeared in the area of the ceiling panel above the co-pilot's workplace. It looked as if the air had thickened slightly, as sometimes happens from a cold air conditioner. It happens. This is not considered a threat. But pilots don't ignore even the little things. Lev handed over the controls to the commander, stood up, examined the ceiling, and took a closer look at the duct. The smoke was gone. The flight attendant confirmed the smell, but said that everything was clean in the cabin. The air conditioning system on the screen showed no abnormalities. And at this point, most of the crews on most flights would consider the situation resolved. It still didn't look like anything serious. But just a few dozen centimeters above their heads, something was happening that would forever change aviation safety. Smoldering began in one of the wiring harnesses of the entertainment system. An arc discharge, a spark, a small burst of heat. And the polyimide film on the thermal insulation layer began to darken slowly, almost imperceptibly. Then melt. And then, to maintain a small flame, clinging to the wiring and spreading along the ceiling in a narrow stream of fire. The pilots didn't see it. And they couldn't see it. A few minutes later, the smoke returned, thicker. It's already more noticeable. It doesn't look like light steam from an air conditioner anymore. The thin lines turned into a steady cloud. It is at this moment that something changes in the captain's tone. He stares at the ceiling longer than before, and he says softly, "It doesn't look like an air conditioner anymore." This is how a chain of decisions begins, each of which is logical at that moment, but will become fatal in the future. They're announcing Pan-Pan, the international emergency signal. The dispatcher suggests Boston, but the crew understands. It's too far away. The alternative is Halifax, just 60 miles away. They have never sat there, but now it is not a question of convenience, but of distance. The co-pilot puts the plane into a descent. The car is falling down, losing 4,000 feet per minute. The speed is growing. You need to control it. Leo increases the speed limit to get to the airport faster. The commander maintains a balance between the need to hurry and the safe limits of the structure. And all this while there's a fire going on above the ceiling that they can't see. British Airways gets in touch, helps with the weather. It saves seconds. Seconds that are too expensive right now. The Swissair 111 is heavy, too heavy. The tank is almost full. We need a fuel dump. Without it, landing would be dangerous. The dispatcher indicates a point south of Halifax. The captain agrees. Logic says that there is time. The smoke is not critical yet. The interior is clean. But fire doesn't wait for logic. When Zimmerman turns off the cabin bus, part of the systems that powered the no-fly zones, he does it according to a checklist. This is the correct action according to the instructions of the time. But it leads to two consequences. The interior is plunged into darkness. The smoke starts moving forward, straight into the cabin, because the fans are turned off. The innovative entertainment system, the source of the problem, remains under current, because it is connected to another bus not mentioned in the checklist. The autopilot turns off, the devices start to malfunction, the smoke is getting thicker, minutes turn into seconds, the situation is on fire. A fire is a fight for life. But this is the next part of the story. If you want, I'll continue exactly from the moment when the fire begins to break into the cabin. The plane continued to descend, as if trying to break the silence of the night and reach the runway, which was still just a dot on the map, a distant landmark in the dark. But time was shrinking. The smoke, which a moment ago seemed like just a nuisance, became denser and more tangible. It no longer resembled steam from an air conditioner. Now it was heavy, acrid air that forced pilots to strain their eyes and breathe more often, despite oxygen masks. Everything happened quickly, but in the cockpit, it felt like a stretch of time. Every second became a separate, independent moment. The co-pilot held the plane manually. The autopilot turned off at the moment when some of the systems were de-energized, and now the heavy MD-11 required precise, confident movements. Lev looked at the main displays, but the brightness began to drop as the smoke obscured symbols, lines, and numbers more and more. He looked down at the small backup instruments, those round duplicate indicators that are rarely used in modern aviation. They were becoming the center of his universe now. He fixed his gaze on each arrow without taking his eyes off for a second. The captain switched power supplies, disconnected sections, and followed a checklist that was designed to calmly identify the problem, rather than the rapid development of a fire. Each completed action offered hope, albeit a vague one, but still hope, that the smoke would decrease, that it would all turn out to be a controlled malfunction. But the smoke did not decrease. It was thickening. It enveloped the panels and instruments, and between the flashes of the alarm lights, it began to seem like a fog through which one had to look at the future. When the cabin was so full that the commander raised his head for the first time, trying to make out the ceiling panel, he saw something that left no doubt. A faint but already visible flame was making its way behind the back of the cabin. That was the moment when everything in the cockpit changed. The smoke could be anything from a ventilation malfunction, a short circuit in a small panel, or local overheating. But the flame was unmistakable. It meant one thing. The fire had become deep, developing, and its source was located where neither the pilot nor the fire extinguisher could reach. The captain gave the dispatcher a short message that the fire had reached the cabin. His voice was still calm, still professional, but there was an intense urgency in his words. But this particular message turned out to be the one that the dispatcher did not hear. The radio channel drowned out some of the words, and the ground did not understand how critical the situation had become. The fire did not just intensify, it went through cable channels, burning through the systems that supported the controllability of the aircraft. A few more seconds, and the light on the pilot's side began to go out. One display, went out completely. Then the second one. Leo found himself in a situation that modern pilots go through only on simulators and only in simulated scenarios. An almost complete loss of instrument indication in the presence of a fire. He pushed the smoke away with his hands, as if trying to clear space so that he could see at least one horizon line, at least one speed figure. But the smoke was getting denser, as if it was trying to hide from him all that was left of the workers. The alarms continued to sound. Some were real: system failure, overheating of channels, loss of electrical lines. Others are false: engine fire, sensor error, computer block collapse. When the indicator of a possible fire in the central engine lit up, Lev could not have known that this signal was a side effect of the unloading wiring and not a real fire. He made the decision to turn off engine number 2. Normally, this would be a difficult but controlled measure. Now it was reducing power, leaving the plane even more vulnerable. At that moment, the temperature above the cabin reached such a force that the metal panels began to deform. The first sound that every pilot fears appeared: the crackle of metal. It meant that the structure was behaving erratically, that the fire had reached not just the cables, but also the supporting elements of the ceiling. The captain got up from his seat and tried to contain the flames with an improvised means, a thick emergency directory. He knew it was powerless, but he acted instinctively. Every pilot tries to fight to the last, even if the fight has no chance. The plane began to tilt imperceptibly. Lev tried to straighten it out, guided by those instrument remnants that were still visible. But the backup sensors began to dim, not only from the smoke, but also from the fact that the power supply was gradually burning out. It seemed that the darkness did not come only from outside. It penetrated into the cockpit itself, absorbing the light of small lamps, enveloping the silhouettes of the pilots. The noise of the ventilation disappeared. It no longer worked. The fire continued to move forward. Another crack, louder than the previous one. Then there was a short pop, like a shattered panel. It was the cabin ceiling that could no longer hold the temperature. The red-hot metal dripped down. On the observer's chair, on the panel, on the floor. This meant that the fire had completely broken through. The pilots were still working. They were still holding the plane. They were still trying to turn towards Halifax. But now it was a blind fight. The smoke became so thick that even at arm's length, nothing could be seen but the dim flashes of emergency lights. Lev leaned forward, almost pressing his face to the dashboard, trying to grab at least some information. But all that remained was a small, almost unreadable hand on the backup indicator, and an inner intuition, trained by thousands of hours in the cockpit. The plane was descending. He was on his way to Halifax. He was on course. But the fire was coming faster. The plane continued to descend, but now this descent was no longer an accurate maneuver of an experienced crew. It became more and more chaotic, as if the car was losing its bearings in the raging darkness. In the cockpit, the darkness mixed with the orange reflections of the fire, and every breath of the pilots passed through the dense smoke, making even the words in the masks heavy, strained. Their voices sounded strained and hoarse, but they continued to work, not allowing panic to enter their thoughts even for a moment. The panel with automatic weapons at the back, the one that separated the pilots from the technical area where the fire was going on, could no longer withstand it. Metal crackled, and at some point a thin line of fire broke through the gap, expanding as if alive. The commander tried to shoot him down again with what was at hand, first with a folder of emergency procedures, then with a fire extinguisher, which could barely cope with the surface flames. But the main hearth was deeper, in a space where a person could not physically reach without disassembling half of the cabin. Meanwhile, the co-pilot was desperately trying to hold the plane. His backup devices were getting weak, and Lev literally pressed his face against the panel to see the values. He could barely see the course. Height is vague. The speed is based on fragmentary data. Still, he kept a straight line, as if even this scant information was enough for him to keep fighting. The outside world has disappeared. There was no horizon, no starry sky, just smoke, fire, and the thud of instruments that went out of order one after another. With each new failure, the plane became more noisy and at the same time more unpredictable. Alarms blinked, beeped, flashed, and then went out. Some of them were caused by real events: overheating, disconnection of lines, loss of sensors. Others are the consequences of the chaos in the wiring. In the cabin, it felt like the car was screaming from all sides at once. But in the midst of this chaos, the pilots continued to work. Below them, there was the blackness of the ocean. Somewhere ahead is Halifax, whose laptop and radar no longer heard a single signal from the Swissair 111. The plane disappeared from radar when the fire reached the transponder. The label is missing from the air traffic controller's display. There is silence on the frequency. But the controllers, knowing how critical the situation had become, cleared the corridor anyway, transferred other planes to make a way for those who might not have heard them already. There came a moment in the cockpit when smoke filled the space to such an extent that the pilots could no longer distinguish the colors of the buttons. Drops of sweat mixed with smoke on Lev's face, and he moved his hand from one device to another almost automatically. But now he could see only one small backup device, the one that showed the pitch angle. He held the plane, focusing almost exclusively on it. All other orientations are gone. The fire intensified. The temperature reached such a mark that parts of the ceiling began to melt, dripping down with red-hot drops of aluminum. They fell on the observer's chair, burning through the fabric, leaving dark spots and smoking holes. The commander tried to protect the instruments, but he understood that everything was beyond the scope of what was possible. And yet, he continued to work, continued to look at the map of Halifax, continued to keep his mind in the mode of decision, not fear. The plane began a subtle lurch to the right. Lev noticed this and tried to correct it. The steering wheel movement was sharp, short, but confident. The plane leveled off a bit, but after a few seconds the roll appeared again. A little stronger now. This meant that the thrust distribution and compensation systems had almost failed. The pilot actually pulled the car manually, without the help of automation, without reliable instruments, through smoke, in conditions of total loss of orientation. The ground was close now, but the cabin became too dark, too hot, too ruined. At one point, the sound of metal cracking became louder. One of the ceiling panels fell off and fell directly onto the dashboard. Flames burst forth, flooding the cabin with orange light. That was the last signal. The structure is not holding up. In such conditions, control of the aircraft becomes impossible. Nevertheless, Leo held the helm to the last. He pulled, adjusted, and fought for the right pedal. It wasn't just aerobatics. It was the inner strength of a man who refuses to let go, even when the whole world is collapsing around him. But the fire was faster, the systems are weaker, and the time is too short. Where the Nova Scotia coastline separates land from the ocean at 22:30 local time, the plane lost control completely. The bank angle increased. The nose dropped a little lower than necessary. The sudden, uncontrollable tilt intensified, and the heavy three-engine liner, having lost everything that made it controllable, slid into the darkness. The impact on the water was instantaneous, and just as instantly, the ocean became quiet again. The only thing that remained were the trembling circles on the surface, which were gradually smoothed out by the night current. The ocean surface trembled under the gentle wind. The wave lines spread out in circles, gradually losing strength, as if the sea was trying to erase the last traces of what had happened. Minutes turned into tens of minutes. The sky remained dark, heavy, devoid of moonlight, and only the occasional lights of the first rescue helicopters were slowly approaching the place, from where not a single radio message was received anymore. There was silence on the frequency. There's a void on the radar. But the controllers knew that if the plane disappeared so abruptly, if the connection was completely lost, if the fire went into an uncontrolled stage, the crew had too few chances. The first Coast Guard vessels reached the crash site in a few tens of minutes. They saw what they always see in the ocean after a devastating impact: pieces of hull, light objects, streaks of fuel glistening on the waves. What should have been a solid, powerful, durable three-engine liner with a length of almost 62 meters was now scattered on the surface like tiny parts of a broken toy. There was a heavy silence on the bridges. The rescuers knew that there was no hope. Hitting the water at a speed of more than 500 kilometers per hour is always an instant end. But the task remained: to find everyone possible and begin the long, painful work of restoring the disaster picture. Soon, more ships arrived in the area. The night slowly turned into early morning, but the light did not bring relief. The ocean, which seemed calm from the air, was actually hiding a giant debris field. They lifted everything they could, carefully, as if every fragment mattered. And it really did. At dawn, Canadian Navy ships appeared on the horizon. Their equipment made it possible to start underwater photography and use sonars. An area of almost 10 square kilometers was marked as a search area. A few hours later, underwater cameras showed for the first time what was in the depths. The wreckage of the plane lay at great depth, scattered with many lines like traces of an explosion. But it wasn't an explosion that happened. It was a blow that could grind metal as if it were made of paper. Soon, a wreckage processing center was set up. A large hangar near Halifax has become a kind of temple of silence. There, under a bright white light on the cold concrete floor, they began to carefully lay out everything they found in the ocean. Pieces of the fuselage, individual panels, wiring elements, interior fragments, engine parts, personal belongings of passengers. The investigators didn't just collect fragments. They reconstructed the life of the plane. Every detail could be a clue. The direction of bending of the metal would indicate the force of the impact. The nature of the melting would indicate the intensity of the fire. The position of the wires would indicate the source of ignition. One thing was clear: the fire started in the upper part of the cabin and spread through the ceiling space. But where exactly? Why is it so fast? Why is it so destructive? To respond, the investigators began to carefully examine the electrical wiring. Meter, long segments, stranded bundles, thin cables. Everything was laid out, cleaned, viewed under magnification. Some were just burnt, others are completely melted, and on some there were small whiskers of molten copper, barely visible to the eye, characteristic traces of an arc discharge. It was the key, the very place where the fire was born. This harness belonged to the entertainment system, the one that remained under current even after disconnecting the electric bus of the cabin. The system, which became a symbol of progress and comfort in 1998, at that moment became the source that started a chain reaction. The short circuit occurred in a narrow space above the cabin. The spark hit the polyimide film, a thin, lightweight material that was supposed to protect the insulation. But this film, instead of protection, became fuel for the fire. She didn't just ignite, she was spreading fire. And she did it very quickly. Another conclusion followed. The checklists used by the crew were not designed for this type of fire. They required dozens of actions, from rechecking systems to disabling individual circuits. But none of the points stated, immediately descend and land at the first appearance of strange smoke. This item was at the very end of the instructions, and the fire was developing according to its own logic, the logic of speed and randomness. Experts examined the entire path of the fire, from the first spark to the moment when the flame completely broke through the ceiling. It was a straight line, a path that the fire had traversed in a matter of minutes. Where the ceiling panels were, the metal was deformed by extreme heat. There were traces of melted plastic where the ducts ran. Where the cables were located, the burning lines indicated a temperature at which even fire-resistant materials could not withstand. But perhaps the most difficult moment for the investigators was to understand, could the pilots have changed anything? And here the answer was as hard as the disaster itself. Even if the crew had started descending immediately after the first smell, even if they had gone straight to Halifax, even if they had refused to dump fuel, they still would not have had enough time. The fire spread too fast. The temperature has risen too sharply. The systems shut down too quickly. The plane was too far away, and this truth was especially painful, because the pilots did their best in the conditions they found themselves in. Stubbornly, professionally, to the last. Their actions have become an example for all future generations of pilots. But there is one more legacy left from their experience: the changes that have affected the entire aviation industry. After the investigation was completed, a large-scale reform began. New requirements for materials covering insulation, mandatory fire resistance when exposed to an arc-E, modified checklists, priority landing, installation of additional smoke detectors, training of crews in active firefighting. And in every document, in every new procedure, there was an unspoken confession. This was done thanks to, or rather because of, the Swissair 111. The tragedy that claimed 229 lives has changed the safety of millions. The quiet gray fog that rose over the coast of Nova Scotia in the days after the tragedy seemed to cover not only the ocean, but also the emotions of the people involved in the search. It wasn't just an accident. Not just an accident. It was a tragedy that touched everyone who somehow stood next to the sea that day. Rescuers, military personnel, local residents, and volunteers. It seemed to permeate the air, thick, humid, heavy. Dozens of people gathered at the port as the search ships returned to shore. loaded with containers with debris. Some of them worked next to the equipment, others just stood at a distance, silently watching. No one spoke loudly. Even the sound of the trucks carrying the found fragments of the plane sounded almost muffled, as if the city instinctively tried to respect the silence of those who had left. Soon, the first relatives began to arrive in Halifax. Swiss, Americans, and French are people from different countries connected by the same problem. Some arrived the very next day, others only a week later, when they could finally gather their strength. And almost every one of them was doing the same thing, driving to the shore. He stood looking at the horizon, and he told the ocean what he hadn't had time to tell the man on the last evening before the flight. Some stood firm. Some were crying. Some just stood motionless, as if hoping to hear something beyond the waterline. Local residents, fishermen, teachers, couples, teenagers, brought flowers, brewed tea, and offered help, even if they didn't know the language or the people who needed it. For one brief moment, this tragedy entwined the fates of complete strangers into a single knot. And in these small towns, where everyone usually knows everyone, there is a sense of community that is difficult to describe in words. Then came the long months of expert work. They sat in the hangar for hours, weeks, months, among the endless rows of debris, markings, pieces of plastic, burnt cables, distorted interior details. Their work was almost inhuman in its concentration, but at the same time extremely humane in its purpose, to understand why this happened, so that no one else will ever go through the same pain. They kept coming back to the same fragments. The elements were compared, restored the structure. They were collecting a painting. Sometimes small personal items were found among the debris. A fragment of a clock, an earring, the keys to the house, someone's folded piece of paper, a burnt photograph. These findings have always been a cruel reminder. Behind every technical conclusion are people who no longer exist. After a while, the Canadian government announced that the crash site would be forever remembered. And soon, 2 memorial complexes appeared on the coast, one in Bay St. Margaret's, the other in Peshkov. They are positioned so that they are directed exactly to the point in the ocean where the plane disappeared. These are not tall monuments, not loud figures. These are rocks. Simple, restrained. They reflect the character of those places, harsh, cold, honest. On the stones are coordinates, words of memory, symbols that everyone understands, regardless of the language. When the memorials were being unveiled, one of the Canadian rescuers said, "We can't bring people back home, but we can make sure that their path does not go unnoticed." Since then, relatives have been coming here, the pilots are coming, engineers are coming. People come who just want to see the place where the tragedy changed the world. They face the ocean, listen to the sound of the waves, and realize that aviation has become safer, precisely because something irreparable happened here. The memory of the Swissair 111 is not only the memory of the tragedy. It is a memory of the fragility of human life, about how thin the line between normality and disaster can be. The fact that even an ideal crew, an ideal aircraft, and precise adherence to procedures cannot always defeat a combination of subtle factors that converge at one point. But perhaps the most important thing is that aviation is learning. Every fragment lifted from the ocean floor, each report sheet, every cable line analysis, every decision is to change the material, the standard, the rule. All this is a direct consequence of the 20 minutes during which a plane was burning over the Atlantic, in which 229 people hoped for a safe flight. Today, as night falls over the ocean again, and dozens of planes take the same route, the crews know the story of the Swissair 111. They know why you can't ignore the smell, why you need to go down right away, why every second is important. And on this night in the cockpit, where the soft glow of the instruments is on, where the quiet noise of ventilation is heard, where the pilots monitor every deviation, there is something that remains of those who flew in September 1998. It's a memory. It's an experience. It's a quiet but eternal lesson. Sometimes the strongest endings are those that do not come immediately after the tragedy. But years later, when the world has already changed, but the memory continues to sound softly, like an echo that cannot be silenced. The history of the Swissair 111 is exactly like that. She didn't disappear with the headlines of the late 90s. It continued to unfold gradually, shaping the future of aviation, joining each new generation of pilots, engineers, and controllers. A few years after the disaster, in one of the Swiss training centers, a huge building filled with simulators, cabins, and computer systems, an instructor told a group of young pilots about the most important emergency situations. Well-known cases appeared on the screen: fire on board, engine failure, depressurization. At some point, he pressed a button, and the name Swissair Flight 111 appeared on the monitor. The audience fell silent. Even those who didn't know all the details knew one thing: it was a turning point. The instructor said a phrase that thousands of pilots around the world have heard. A fire is a race against time, and time always runs faster than it seems. He showed diagrams of the spread of fire in the MD-11, demonstrated real recordings of negotiations, noted on the projections where the wiring was located, how the insulation was smoldering, how the fire was going through the ceiling. But there was more than just an explanation of the technical details in his voice. There was respect. Respect for those people who, in the smoke, heat, and complete failure of the systems, continued to fight to the very end. This story became something personal for every young pilot. She reminded me that no technology can replace mindfulness. No modern system can compete with determination. And no crew should ignore even the slightest odor, which seems insignificant, because sometimes it is he who is the first sign that a decision needs to be made immediately. Thousands of kilometers away from this center, in Canada, along the coast of Nova Scotia, winds continued to blow among the low stones of the memorial. One of them stands on a hill, simple, strict, aimed precisely at the point in the ocean where the plane once disappeared. The second one is closer to the water, among the rocks. Between them is a line extending into the sea. They sort of connect the living with those who haven't returned. You can often see people standing there, not talking. Sometimes they are relatives who arrived many years later. Sometimes there are tourists who read about the tragedy. Sometimes they are active pilots who came here before the first international flight, to remember that their profession requires not only skill, but also responsibility that extends beyond technology. One of these pilots, a young Canadian, said later that at that moment, standing in front of the memorial, he truly felt the burden of his profession for the first time. He said, "You understand that every button, every point of the procedure is someone's life, and sometimes as many as 229 lives. The memory of the Swissair 111 is present, not only in gyms, not only in memorials, but also in the sky itself. Today, when an airplane flies over that area, the crews often mentally mark the point, not as a scary landmark, but as a reminder that aviation has become safer due to mistakes that should never happen again. Up there, at an altitude of 10 kilometers, everything seems calm. Passengers would read magazines, watch movies on modern screens, listen to music, without even suspecting that the very entertainment system that destroyed the Swissair 111 is built completely differently today, with dozens of protection levels, with materials that do not burn, with automation that monitors the slightest temperature changes. Every time a team of engineers tests a new material, a new sensor, or a new cable channel, they take into account the experience of past tragedies, and one of the most important among them remains the Swissair 111. These tests, fire, voltage, arc, shock, vibrations, are all done to ensure that no other aircraft is trapped in the same way as the MD-11 that night. And when the next test is successful, when the new material does not light up, when the new sensor is triggered on time, when the new system shuts down as it should, engineers sometimes say to each other quietly, almost in a whisper, "This is for those who were on that flight." Sometimes memory manifests itself not in words, not in monuments, but in actions, in the standards, in technology. The thing is, now that the pilot can smell it, he knows he doesn't have time to wait. He only has a chance. Only the solution is the fastest, sharpest, and most correct. And that's why today, when night falls on the Atlantic, and the planes are flying along the same route again, their cabins are illuminated with soft lights, dozens of security systems are working in them in case something goes wrong. Passengers are sleeping, listening to music, reading books, and somewhere deep in the metal, in the cables, in the algorithms, the Swissair 111 experience is written. He's always there, invisible, but not forgotten. ChatGPT said, "Then imagine the night, the ocean, and the quiet sound of waves that stretches to the horizon. The camera slowly glides over the surface of the water, where there has been no debris or traces for a long time. Only deep silence. In the distance, the lights of a modern liner are flashing, going the same way that the Swissair 111 once passed. Its lights are steady, calm. He flies confidently in a protected, thoughtful, multi-layered aerial world, which became such precisely because of the tragedies of the past. The voiceover remains soft but confident. There are no casual lessons in aviation. Each point of the procedure is written by someone's fate. Every test of materials is someone's memory. And when planes pass over this area of the ocean, they fly not only along the route, they are flying along the line that has changed the world forever. The line drawn on September 2nd, 1998, Swissair 111 lines. The camera rises higher, showing a small plane against the background of